Welcome back, Gangaji.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And I'm joined today by Sarah Rozenthuler.
I'm delighted to be having the conversation with you, Gangaji.
Oh, likewise. Happy to meet you.
Now, I remember during our first conversation, the film Woodstock was a pivotal turning point for you.
Yes, it was. For much of the world, I believe, and so I was part of that wave.
And that took you from Mississippi to the Bay Area.
Yes, from the South. By that time I was teaching school in Memphis, Tennessee, and already my world had shifted in terms of recognizing that the way I had been brought up, essentially as a conventional racist in the South, was not correct, was really a great error. And so I had already had the ground shift under me. But that was a very serious recognition, and Woodstock showed me the celebration of the recognition of anti-war, pro-civil rights, but also life, celebration of life.
And you kindly shared with me last time that initially when you got to the Bay Area, you practiced hedonism before you
Yes.
before you were introduced to spirituality, I guess. And
Yes.
I think one of the important teachers in your life was Kola Rinpoche.
Yes, I was living at that time in a small town in California, on the coast of California, and by some stroke of luck, he accepted an invitation to come there, which was really amazing. It's close to San Francisco, and he was in San Francisco visiting, but it was astounding to have a Rinpoche of his statue come to this little town. And that energy galvanized us. There were just like a dozen of us supporting his visit. And yes, that's when I became a Buddhist. I took bodhisattva vows and did different empowerments, and he was my root guru, I would say.
And from there, I think you were guided towards Zen.
Well, Tibetan Buddhism is so extraordinary and beautiful and exquisite, and at the core, of course, it's all the same, but the display of Tibetan Buddhism and the phenomenal experiences that would often occur in particular meditations, I found to be a distraction for me, because I was easily distracted by phenomenal occurrences and the beauty of it. And there was something in Zen Buddhism when I first experienced that was so sober, so completely serious, so unmoving. And I heard the word emptiness as reality for the first time in that practice. And I recognized that for me, I wouldn't say it's true for anyone else necessarily, but for me, as this form and its tendencies, it was just what I needed. It was like ballast. It just grounded me in not doing anything or not achieving anything.
And I'd love, Gangaji, to hear a bit about your encounter with Papaji as well. I've been enjoying reading your book, Hidden Treasure, and I also saw you speak a few years ago in London at the Quaker Meeting House. I was there with you in the room, and my understanding is that the encounter with Papaji has been transformational in your life, and I'd just love to hear a bit more about that.
Well, it's really there have been so many extraordinary events that led to that event, but it was the event that set my life right, that put me right side up. Because in meeting Papaji, first of all, I recognized he was my teacher. And I felt the welcome of this being who I recognized as a teacher totally welcomed me without knowing if I had any talents or if I had good karma or bad karma or my practice. It just welcomed me. He said, yes, come in. His arms wide. And so that in itself was tremendous. And then he, through his grace and his very sober instruction, told me that whatever I was doing, to stop. And I was able to hear that phrase, stop whatever you're doing. I allowed into my consciousness, and I recognized he wasn't speaking really about physical activity. He was speaking about mental activity. So it wasn't about sitting in a particular posture. It was about living in a particular posture, a posture that's coming from that which is always stopped, that which is the core of life, the core of each of us. And by some mystery, I could hear that from him. And yes, my life is very much the same in many ways. It's the same form and really the same tendencies of habit in this form, but right side up, so that it's a form. It's such a mystery, you know. I try speaking about it, and I'm always happy to speak about it, and I speak about it a lot, whether I'm invited to or not. But I've never been able to capture the momentousness of meeting someone who, just by saying very few words to me, could invite me so deeply into myself.
That's a beautiful way to put it, that invitation to go deeply into yourself. And yeah. I'm also struck by you saying how you recognized him as a teacher as well, in the expansiveness of his presence and how he welcomed you as well. So, sorry, we've just got a slight distraction going on there. I'm curious as to what extent do you think we need to have a teacher or a guru to really sort of get on that path of transformation? I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I don't believe that there's a formula that fits all, first of all. And Papaji would say that the true teacher, the Satguru, is alive within us. And the external teacher is a representation of that only when we can't really listen to and obey the Satguru. And in a true sense, I accept all of life as the Satguru, the true Guru, the mystery of life, the hugeness of it, the uncontrollableness of life. But by the time I met Papaji, I was in my late 40s, and I had met different teachers and benefited from them. But I knew I needed something. And this was interesting because before I knew this, I was certain I didn't need a teacher. That I'm a Western woman, I'm independent, I was feminist, I had seen the different guru traps and it seemed like a codependent relationship with student and guru. So I was certain I didn't need a teacher. And then I was certain I did. I recognized that I had done what I could do. And I needed someone who could reflect back to me something that I could receive, bigger than the way I was holding the universe. And maybe other teachers had done that, but the mystery was that when I met Papaji, I was ready to meet him, and I was hungry to meet a true teacher, and he saw that, and he gave me what I asked for. So for me, it was all important. And I know it's not true for some people. I would just suggest that everyone stay open. As I said before, I was certain I needed a teacher. I was certain I didn't need a teacher. And these certainties that we have in our minds, in our thinking minds, are just not reliable. They may be reliable for a time, but we have to be willing to be open and allow our universe to be bigger than what we think it is, because it is. It's always bigger than what we think it is.
Thank you. I hear about, yes, how it helps to have that openness and the willingness to change as well. So, is there any perspective you have then on how we, and it might be, you know, a woman living in the West, or, you know, a parent with children, or with a busy day job, like how we might access more easily that inner teacher that you speak of?
Well, you know, it seems to me, in my own experience, and speaking to as many people as I've spoken to, that life knocks us around a bit. And as the Buddha said, life is suffering, that there is a lot of pain in the experience of living a life. And if we are willing to allow that pain to open us, rather than to turn us into a cynical frame of mind, then it all reveals itself. I mean, in my view, it's such a supreme mystery, and it is finally the mystery of life dancing with itself in form and formlessness. And this is so beyond any attempts that we all practice to control life, or to direct it, or even to better it. There's something so much bigger at play. And finally, the invitation is to surrender. Very different from resign. I'm not speaking of resignation. I'm speaking of really surrender, conscious, open surrender. And from that, then, discovery is natural. We're naturally curious beings, and when we surrender to that curiosity and where that curiosity comes from, the source, then I do trust that we are directed in the right place. It doesn't mean that we won't fall on our faces, and it doesn't mean that the right place is filled with safety. It can be a very unsafe place. It's the unknown, so it is primarily perceived as unsafe, but then it's revealed as your own self.
Beautiful, thank you. And I love what you, about being open to the pain and how the pain can be catalytic in surrendering as well. And I'd love to hear a bit as well about your own journey and transition into teaching. I know when I saw you in London, it was a full room. I think there were hundreds of people there. I remember you having some live conversations with people on the stage, people who were in pain, people who were really struggling with different issues, whether that was relationships or work. And just how has it been for you to cross the threshold into teaching yourself?
It's been a surprise. I never expected to be a teacher. I love the role of a student. It's such a receiving role, and I was so surprised when Papaji asked me to go back, and he didn't say teach, he said share your experience. And I said, well, Papaji, I haven't read Ramana's books, I don't know even what the teaching is. And he said, good, there are enough teachers and teachings in the world. You just share your experience. And I was petrified. I thought it was too soon. I didn't feel like I was ready. I hadn't been through enough experiences. And then after that, maybe 6 weeks after that, I had a really tremendous experience where I could only express it as the removal of doubt. And it happened just in a flash, in an instant. And then teaching or not teaching was secondary. They were both just roles. Neither one of them had anything to do with the truth of who I am. And so it was, of course, perfect that it was at that moment in that period of time that someone came up to me and actually asked me what my experience was and had questions, and that it began that simply and that naturally. It was never a plan, and I never had a goal of how many people should come and how it should look, and it's been 23 years, over 23 years now, and it's still a surprise. And I'm still a student. So in that sense, nothing changed. But I have the permission, first from my guru and then from those people who attend and are willing to engage deeply and closely, to be myself. And that's really what I'm inviting all of us to be, that in this acceptance and being of oneself, we find love and we find wisdom and we discover appropriate action, appropriate work. So in that sense, we are all teachers and we're all students.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, I know an important time for you was when Papaji left his body.
Yes, I have said, and I accept it as true, that it was as important as meeting him, which was the most important. But then paradoxically, his leaving, his precious, beautiful form leaving, was crucial to actually receiving what he had pointed to me, which doesn't come and go. I felt grief at losing his form, and I saw some videos of the burning ghats, and as I took his body to the ghat and burned it, and there's a priest who breaks the pelvis bone and the skull so that it burns more easily, and so it was a shock, but it was a really good shock, as I realized how fragile all of our forms are and how we all come and go as form. And then the deeper discovery of what cannot be taken away, cannot be lost. And this is essential, of course. This form is going. I mean, I'm at a certain age in my life where I know however long it lasts, it's the last phase. And so that's an invitation to experience the depth of the preciousness of form and the mystery of the formless that doesn't move. I would say all death is that invitation. My sister died recently, and my younger sister, so that was a surprise, and I went back to a memorial for her in the South, in Mississippi, and meeting with family that I hardly ever go back there, and just to feel that the death itself revealed love. And of course life itself can reveal that if we're willing. Usually, habitually, certainly in the Western culture, we're so busy that we don't allow these issues, these essential issues of birth and death to appear in our internal conversation. But when we're willing to actually meet death, the finality of the death of the form, and open to that soberly, there is a mysterious beauty and life that is discovered. And so I don't wish death. I don't want death for my form or your form, or certainly not for Papaji's form. But so what? My wishes and my wants are irrelevant in this uncontrollable power of life. And it's really life that holds both birth and death. Life remains.
And staying on the theme of grief, what does the difference between pain and suffering mean for you?
Well, very simply, pain is sensation. I mean, I recently had a toothache, and that's very painful. And I broke my wrist, and that's painful. And your heart can be broken by reading the newspaper, or someone turning from you, or someone suffering. And that's a pain, and it's an emotional pain or a physical pain, and it is discomfort. But suffering is a narrative added to that pain that then continues. So it's taking pain of a heartbreak or a physical ailment and infusing that with your life force so that it has time. If pain is met as it is, whether it's physical or emotional, you can penetrate it with your consciousness, and it is really then not personal. It's sensational, it's vibratory, and in the core there is silence. It's only our addition to pain that makes it suffering. And since we are thinking creatures, we do think when we have particular sensations, and that thinking, if we continue to think along those lines, becomes suffering. However it starts, it can actually start with great comfort, or pain-freeness, or well-being, but when we add our thinking to that and try to keep that, or make that about us, or something even we did, then that's the root of suffering, because it does come and go. Sensations come and go. Pain comes and goes. Well-being comes and goes. What doesn't come and go is the life that they all come and go in. And so pain can be an entry. I don't want to glorify pain or spiritualize it even. It's not likable, but it's an event in life. And life is filled with events, some of which are quite painful. So I don't teach or counsel people to avoid pain, or fight pain, or deny pain, or escape pain, or indulge pain, but to really just simply open to it. Then there's an intimacy, and like all intimacy, there can be discomfort, but it's finally welcome. In the deepest intimacy, you and other, whether that's another person or a sensation, are welcome home. So suffering is where you are not welcome, and other is not welcome, and sensation is not welcome, and that's a tragedy. And there is some suffering, of course. There's suffering there. There's stories of people going through suffering right now as we speak. There's genocide on our planet. There's slavery on our planet. In our neighborhoods, there are familial stories of suffering, and so I don't want to trivialize those stories of suffering by saying they're just stories of suffering. They have a purpose too, and for those of us who are willing to give up the story of suffering, then we are actually more available for those of us whose stories of suffering are defining their lives. And may the light spread to those who perpetuate the suffering on others and those who are victimized by it.
One of the things I'm hearing you say is about the way that the narratives we tell ourselves, the stories that we tell ourselves might contribute to the suffering we're experiencing, and just curious about how we might, I think you write about this, kind of deconstructing our stories, finding a more naked self, and just love to hear you say a few words about how we can do some of that deconstruction.
Yes, well, the key is to recognize how we have to continually construct the narrative After a while it's so familiar that it's like putting on some old clothes, but you still have to put on the clothes. I love that you use the word naked. It's really a willingness to be naked to yourself with no story, however legitimate that story may be and however relatively true. So in no story, then, I'm even speaking of no story of gender, no story of parents, no story of love or loss of love, no story of future or past, no story of present, to really be naked and be conscious in that nakedness. I mean, we do this every night when we fall into deep sleep, but this is to be awake and to have the same experience that we have in deep sleep, just to stop the construction. People often ask, well, how do I deconstruct? And the first and the essential, really essential, is to recognize in this very moment, how are you constructing a story, your story? And then, equally important, to have the willingness to stop that construction, to let it all fall down. Just in an instant, you can put it back together. The next moment, this is not a dogma, it's not a religion or a practice of having no story. It's to take an instant and recognize that you are still here. Whether your story appears or disappears or changes or transforms or gets better or worse, you are still here. And you are, by your nature, free and at peace and in love.
Thank you. It's a radical, well, I was going to say it's a radical alternative, what I'm hearing you say, to the path that I think many of us take. I know that I've taken in moments of my life of seeking fulfillment through, whether that's through work or the bigger house or the next relationship, whereas what I hear you talking about is a way of finding a deeper and truer fulfillment through really getting in touch with, I think you said, that which is changeless, or that which is still with us through the different stories that we tell ourselves.
Yes, you say it exactly. There are fulfillments in work and relationship, and if you can, get better work and better relationships, but none of them are lasting fulfillments. There is the truth of lasting fulfillment, which is found when you discover what doesn't come and go. And for some people, this may mean God, or love, or silence. For me, the word I'm using lately is life. Life does not come and go. And life is not some dead space that can be scientifically objectified. It is the animation of everything. So then there's nothing that is separate from this that does not come and go. So in a moment of pain, or a moment of being in the wrong relationship or the wrong job, you have the capacity to actually ask yourself and reflect on what is still here. Is life still here? Where is life? And we find it within us, but not just within us. It's within us and outside us. We are in it. And to me, the wonder of that, which gets put aside quite often as we grow up and are educated and socialized, and as we receive the advertisements of our cultures, we lose some kind of initial intimate wonder to be. But it doesn't lose us. It's still here. And in the willingness to take a moment of retreating from your particular life story, your particular life conditions, and discover the source of that, then there is life that is awareness, aware of itself, And that is fulfillment. And in that fulfillment, there's room for pain, and certainly room for changing jobs, or being thrilled with good relationships and happy events, and being heartbroken over sad events. There's room for everything because it's life. There's already room. We don't even have to make room. It's here. But we can recognize that. And often our particular lives shrink so that we don't recognize how big this whole mystery is, and how present this moment it all is.
And staying on the theme of relationships, I've been listening to a program, I think I downloaded it from Sounds True, The Greatest Discovery. And you mentioned that relationships are like warfare, which I'd never heard before, but now I've heard you speak about it, I can relate to that.
Well, it's this, if it gets down to it, it's this survival drive, me. And that is, of course, initially physical, but then it's also emotional, me. And I'm not against that in any way. I'm pro-survival. And I think it's very useful in relationship to understand boundaries and to understand needs of particular bodies and emotions. But in general, other is in some way seen as both that which is needed, and maybe because that is needed, it's also seen as the enemy, that which can take away or leave. And we know that disappears in moments of real intimacy, a real kiss, or a real friendship. It disappears, but it can reappear, and that's really what I think I was referring to then. When it reappears, it's as a kind of war, where we are strategizing how to relate, and we're planning. And I don't recall that particular part of the Sounds True recording, so I'm not sure what the context was. But I can say that for myself, I had to be willing to see how my marriage of, at that point, over 30 years, even though we were deepest of friends, and we had an incredible spiritual bond where we were completely at ease and happy, and we had both found our true lives in meeting Papaji, still there was a middle ground where we were making war, almost subconsciously, and it was just based on old stories that had become embedded in the body of our relationship. And so it was necessary to flush that out, like an old thorn that gets flushed out of a wound when it's been covered over. And in flushing it out, then it's, as you were saying, the deconstruction could appear, and we could recognize it. We could recognize the war. So really it's an invitation simply to be willing to investigate, am I at war in any way in my relationships? Even in the name of peace, in the name of harmony, in the name of being loving. Is that a strategy? And in that recognition, to be willing to really discover peace. I don't think we can make peace, but we can discover peace, because it is finally the core. And it's not just the core of oneself, it's the core of other. And that can be startling, because we can see other as the threat to my peace. And nothing can really threaten true peace.
And what does love mean to you?
What does love? Everything, I would say. Love is home. And it's not a one-roomed home. It's the universe. I really think when we are suffering, we are sick for home. We are yearning for home. And that home is love. It's I don't see it as separate from life. When I use the word life, I'm not making a distinction between love and life. Life as the animation of energy is one aspect of itself, and love is as the mystery is this aspect of itself. So in that sense, it's the source of everything. I mean, really, it's a source of ease and of pain. It's a source of the release of suffering, and it's a source of suffering. I mean, we don't grieve when we lose what we don't love. We grieve when we lose what we love. So grief has its source love and fear. I mean, when we have fear, it's because we fear ultimately that our life will be taken from us, that there's some threat to our life, and that's because we love our life. So I don't see love as separate from anything. I understand how it gets thwarted and misused and sentimentalized and compartmentalized, but that's also a mystery and part of this really extraordinary dance that we as forms of life forms of love, go through. It's in the East they call it Leela, the dance of God, the play of God. You could just as easily call it the play of love. Yes, God is love. I'd say that's what God is to me, love. And it's here in all of us, just waiting.
One of the things I love about your book, Hidden Treasure, are the points of inquiry which you give at the end of some of the chapters, and you write about the power of inquiry. And just curious about, as you're dancing your way through your own life at the moment, what lines of inquiry might be running through you, what questions you might be asking yourself at the moment?
That's a good question. Well, you know, as playing the role of teacher, there's always this inquiry, how can I speak this in a way that is simple and relevant, not abstracted from a person's life, and filled with the transmission that I received from my Papaji, from my guru and his guru Ramana. So that's an ongoing inquiry. It's a discovery. And then in a more mundane way, you know, I don't know if you're aware of what's been happening politically in the States, but it's a mess. And I'm a political animal, so I read the newspaper and I have opinions and I feel emotions get stirred up, and then there's a point of inquiry, not to fix that or to like, oh, I should be feeling forgiveness or feeling love for these people. I see it all as love, so I don't have to feel love to recognize it's all love. But I also get to see that the events that trigger particular emotions in my life are very useful. And I really want to stress, I'm not saying useful because then I can fix them to be a better person. Just useful as they are humbling. And it's very useful for the thinking mind to be humbled. And in that, the meeting, I recently, I was saying I went to my sister's memorial in Mississippi, and I was back in the South, and I recognized the things I had fought in the South, racism and the horror that my ancestors had perpetrated. I had somehow, when I went back there, I was able to see that the very good people perpetrated really horrible things. In their minds, those weren't horrible things. They were the order of the day, even if they were it was slavery, and if it was economically determined, still in their minds, the way they made sense of it, so that they could still love their children, they could still be good people to their neighbors. And I realized that I had made a distinction between the actions that they had done, which were absolutely wrong and had to be corrected, and the truth of who they were, which is still love. I knew I loved my father, and I disagreed with him completely, politically and culturally too. And I knew my love had never been swayed in that disagreement. And somehow it was just in going back to the South and being in that atmosphere and seeing and being, it was an integrated memorial, which when my sister was born, it never could have been. So that there had been changes, to see that and to speak of changes with certain people who had worked for civil rights when I was there. So, but to include it all. So that's my inquiry. It took me a while to get there, but that's it. To include it all.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for the simplicity and the depth with which you speak as well. And that I loved what you were saying earlier about it's not so much about teaching, but sharing your experience. So I appreciate both the substance of what you're saying, but also your articulation as well. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Now, last time we spoke, I think you were going to take a group to India. So how did that go?
Oh, wonderfully. There were 170 of us, and we went back to the town where Papaji ended his life, where he actually grew up in what is now Pakistan, but he had to leave there as he was Hindi. And so he was in Lucknow, which is not a really beautiful town. I mean, there are certain parts of it that are beautiful, but it's overcrowded, it's noisy, it's polluted, it's traffic jams and chaos. But that's where his satsang bhavan, where he gave satsang, is, and where he ended his days. His bedroom is still kept intact, and so of course that's why we would bring people, and we were invited there by a couple, Bharat Mitra and Bhavani, who were devotees of Papaji and who have founded Organic India and have really contributed to India having hundreds of thousands of fields in organic cultivation of herbs and vegetables and flowers. So they have a farm there, and we had our meetings on the farm and in Lucknow, and it was incredible. It was so beautiful. I mean, India, for me, physically, as this form, is not easy, but it is India, and it is where this deepest inquiry really got started, where humans were evolved enough to actually reflect, what does it mean to be? Who am I? And whether you're Buddhist or Hindu or Christian, I mean, you can trace it all back to India, the actual impetus to look deeply, to find a bigger life. So people benefited enormously from it, and many people went to Rishikesh to be near the Ganga and near Haridwar, where I had actually met Papaji, and they loved that. And many people got sick, and I would say most people really use that in a very deep way. I mean, it's just part of being a life form, that there are assaults on the life form, and there are medicines and there's support for that, and there's pain. But the reports I've heard have just been incredible. It was right siding up for many people. So I'm really happy that it went well.
And your own foundation, the Gangaji Foundation, how did that come into being?
Well, I was teaching in different places, but primarily in Boulder, Colorado, 20 years ago. We're having a 20-year anniversary soon, and just some of the students said it's time to set up an organization so that this can happen more congruently, because it was just, as I said, it was a surprise to me. I didn't know if anybody would show up for a meeting, and then all of a sudden hundreds of people were showing up, and there are certain logistics that need handling in that. When it started on Maui, it was in my living room, and I was plumping the pillows and sweeping the floor, and then it grew, and I needed help, and help appeared in this formation of the Gangaji Foundation. And it's amazing to me. That's 20 years ago. Of course, it just seems like it just happened, and yet there's a 20-year history. I happened to be reading a book about the Beatles, or an article about the Beatles coming to the U.S. in 1965, and the author of the article said that was exactly 20 years after World War II ended. And it just threw me aback. First of all, I remember when the Beatles came, and it seemed like World War II was ancient history at that time, but it was just 20 years. And then I think the Gangaji Foundation has been going for 20 years. That's as long as between the ending of World War II and when the Beatles appeared. It just shows me the fluidity of time. That sometimes it's very close and sometimes it's like very fast, but here it is, really, all the same moment. And we celebrate time because that's part of what it means to be a human being. Our bodies, our forms, have times, and then those times are over.
And also, we should let people know there are a lot of free resources on your website, gangaji.org. There's the monthly radio shows, your monthly podcast.
Yes, I will spell my name for people, because if you go online, you can find everything pretty easily. It's GANGAJI.org. And we have a new website that will be up soon. The old one is still functioning, and it's fine, but we're really happy about a new one we've been working on to make it more accessible, and we'll have download streamings, and I hope it'll come online soon. These things keep getting pushed. Speaking of time, it was supposed to be available months ago, but it will come when it comes. But I use the technology quite a bit, like this. I was speaking to a group on the monthly podcast meetings and recognizing that in this sense we have transcended time and space. That you can be in England, I'm in Oregon, you're in a particular time, I'm in a very different time, and yet here we are. And I know that 30 years ago, that idea of transcending time and space was very different from the reality that we are living in, of transcending time and space. So what a mystery that is.
Thank you for being so generous with your time.
Yeah, it's been great to talk with you, Gangaji. Really enjoyed our conversation and hearing you live and direct.
Thank you. I feel the same way. It's really beautiful to see your faces, and you can see the animation, the love, the life that's present, and that's why we all have each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we mentioned the Beatles earlier. Would you like to leave people with a song from the Beatles today?
All you need is love.
Absolutely.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.